Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisunionlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisunionlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
A couple of weeks ago on the podcast, we discussed the phenomenon of belonging. And in our discussions about that, we realized there was a really rich territory to explore around the opposite, which we're calling today exile and alienation. And we're understanding that these terms mean something slightly different, and there's lots of different meanings to each of the terms, so we have a lot of ground to cover. And maybe we want to start off just by defining these terms. What do we think? What is exile and what is alienation?
Well, the word exile comes from the Latin exilium and was a political tool and as an option to capital punishment. In the ancient world, to be exiled from a city was often a life-threatening phenomena, both in terms of the isolation, but in terms of the protection of the city-state. So it was considered a tremendously harsh punishment and comparable with the death penalty in that culture.
Well, it could be very hard to survive on your own. Even in more ancient times preceding Roman times, human beings need the tribe. And so to be banished, exiled, cut off, could mean death. And today, I think, there are communities that practice exile, practice shunning. Psychologically, I think it has much the same effect.
We see the resurfacing of that in cancel culture. This old archetype, very old archetype of grabbing hold of someone and for any number of reasons, exiling them from their corporation, their university, from the neighborhood.
And of course, this touches into another thing we've talked about in an earlier episode, which is the scapegoat. Because the goat was actually exiled from the community in the ancient Hebrew rite. And that is often what's happening in cancel culture, I think, is that someone is having the sins of the group kind of placed upon his or her head and then is exiled in an effort to kind of purify the group. So that can be a function of exiling. I think of exile conjures up for me an emotional experience, often of longing, that when one is in exile or living in exile, there's often a great sorrow and a sense of a home that has been lost and perhaps one that cannot be returned to.
I'm back on you guys having referenced cancel culture and shunning and the Roman origins of the word of what a tremendous amount of violence there is in exiling someone psychologically or literally. It was an alternative to capital punishment. And
Yeah.
I think that's what happens today, is that the person is demonized, dehumanized,
Yeah.
kind of thrown to the wolves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the underpinnings of violence here are something I'm really paying a lot of attention to.
Mm. Yeah, and we can wonder whether, at least in some cases of exile, is if there isn't shadow projection at work onto he whom is exiled. What about alienation, though? How are we going to define that roughly before we get too far down the track here?
It seems to me, and this is where language gets so sort of tricky and sticky, but that alienation is more of an internal state, whereas exile seems to be more interpersonal, of that feeling of being cut off from oneself and not having access to one's own inner connection and aliveness.
Mm.
So that alienation feels more sort of like an inner lack of access to feeling.
Yeah, again, just thinking about it sort of as an emotional experience, I think that alienation feels like a kind of inner deadness or an emptiness.
Yeah. There are some classic pictures of a dejected prophet sitting on a rock in the wilderness. So the wilderness is a great symbol for this. But that kind of despair and hopelessness and inner powerlessness and lack of connection to self.
I find myself resting into the word alien and just asking myself, what feels alien to me? Or even the process of something feeling alien and then feeling familiar, this way that both our psyche and perhaps even our neurologic processes make something alien or familiar, even in the most common sense. Like we move into a new home and the house feels alien to us, and then after about 6 months, we have enough memories and experiences for it to transfer into the familiar. And strangely enough, as an internal system, the kind of trauma that takes what is familiar and make it alien. Something is either added or extracted to the object relation, and it changes our relationship to it. And that's, as we said, an internal process.
Yeah, I'm thinking about alienation as kind of a modern condition. And many people have written about this, that it's a particular quality of, say, a lot of 20th century art. I'm thinking about The Stranger by Camus. The opening lines are, mother died yesterday, or maybe it was today, or I'm not sure. And, it's just this indifference that the novel opens with, this sense of being cut off from real authentic feeling. And, I think that Jung was very interested in this idea. I think that he saw that we were, as moderns, often cut off, alienated from our instincts, alienated from the body. That my favorite book that I mention all the time on the podcast, it's probably getting incredibly irritating, The Master and His Emissary. Gilchrist talks about how a kind of a hypertrophied left hemisphere experience of the world is very alienating, that it leaves us alienated from ourselves. Alienation is a major feature of painting in the 20th century, and it kind of defines certain artistic movements such as surrealism. You look at these incredible surrealist paintings and you have that feeling of just alienation where kind of nothing makes sense. You're sort of floating out in space.
Or the familiar has been distorted in a way that it feels bizarre and alien.
Yeah.
And I think, here's what Jung has to say about that, which is much what you're saying. Is he says, since the unconscious gives us the feeling that it is something alien, a non-ego, it is quite natural that it should be symbolized by an alien figure. So I think that has bearing on it. And I can't help but think of the movie Alien. Oh, like, oh my gosh, talk about non-ego.
Yeah, it's really other.
Other, this thing that we could not relate to at all. And it's interesting to think of something as monstrous as that being the symbol of what we cannot access in ourself, whether it's sort of right brain a la McGilchrist or something deeper in ourselves that we just don't have a relationship with.
Yeah. That's really great.
And then it becomes monstrous.
Yes.
Monstrous or numinous. I'm thinking that when the unconscious projects onto an object or invests it, or actually could be simultaneous, both horrifying and numinous at the same time, which the creature in Alien kind of is. It's kind of godlike.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it's horrifying.
It's kind of raw nature. And, Joseph, that is just really brilliant. And what it makes me think of is because I think that the state of alienation can feel like deadness and utter lack of meaning. And it seems like, Deb, as you were saying, when that which is within us is so other and we cannot have a relationship with it, then we feel alienated, cut off, life drains of meaning, everything kind of turns to shades of gray. We're sort of floating out there in this disconnected state. The medicine for that, Joseph, is where you just went, is when that which is other and feels either monstrous or just kind of disconnected begins to become infused with the numinous energy, even if it's terrifying. So in some way, it's so much better to be terrified of the other than to just have kind of no feeling about it at all. And once we're in the realm of terror, then we're well on our way to reconnecting with it.
That goes back to your comment earlier where you had mentioned alienation from oneself, that the ego is only one factor in the psyche, and that the psyche is populated by all kinds of things. And if there's often a trauma, the ego can become walled in temporarily or permanently, and then all these other interactions with inner objects are impaired. We don't have access to feelings or inspiration. And most damagingly, we don't have access to our desires, which really shape our whole momentum.
Yes, exactly.
I think what you said about the connection, even if it is through horror or terror, is incredibly brilliant, Lisa. We're all being really brilliant today, aren't we?
As usual.
Because it's the return of feeling.
Yeah.
And then you're in relationship to it. And of course, the great classic archetypal story of this is Job's encounter with Yahweh, with God, where he is trembling in fear, but it affords him a connection with that incredible archetypal numinous other that also reconnects him with himself. That's Jung's medicine, is that we need to be connected with the self, with the other, with something that is greater, with the infinite.
And if we stay with the example of Job, that we have to develop a kind of grit, that we have to develop a stamina for engaging the unconscious because of the spectrum of exaltation and suffering that always brings forward. And this is ubiquitous in therapy and analysis. Often a client comes, in the beginning, maybe we're just listening, we don't say much. But eventually, as analysts, we're going to lift up something that is suppressed in the psyche. And the first thing everyone is up against is the impulse to alienate from it. That alienation can become a defense. It can become a way of life to avoid things that are painful or frightening, both in us and outside of ourselves. There's a self-alienation that's implied in every gated community. I want the uncomfortable stuff to stay out, however I characterize that, and I only want the familiar and comforting close to me.
That takes us into the territory of shadow. What is walled out or the effort to wall it out, which, of course, the process of therapy is about reconnecting with and recognizing and integrating.
So I want to bring in a film that's coming to my mind right now, and it's The Graduate. So if you remember, the opening credits are Dustin Hoffman returning home from college, and he's going through an airport. And then he gets home, and his parents are, kind of cloying and, what are you going to do, Benjamin? They want him to sort of get out on his career. And then there's this great scene toward the beginning of the movie. It may be right at the beginning. I don't know. It's been too long since I've seen it, where he's in a scuba diving outfit, and I believe it's his birthday party. And he's viewing the world through the scuba mask and going into the pool, and he's seeing the world of his parents who kind of live in this very superficial, persona oriented way. That he feels like nothing has meaning. There's a disconnection, there's a real alienation. And there's this great line where one of the guests at the party says, "Benjamin, the future's in plastics," which sort of says it all. That it's there's nothing authentic. It's all ersatz. And in this state of alienation, he winds up meeting and having an affair with Mrs. Robinson. And it's when he falls in love with Elaine, and she's the anima figure, that meaning is restored and the feeling function is awakened. And then the movie is very ambivalent at the end as to whether or not he's able to redeem this relationship with the feminine principle out of the wreckage of this meaninglessness that gave rise to this affair with Mrs. Robinson. And the theme of alienation, there's one other scene where he says to her, he wants to have a connection at one point. He says, "Mrs. Robin, let's talk about something." She said, "What do you want to talk about?" "Oh, I don't know. Let's talk about art." And she says something, "I don't know anything about art." And then a few minutes later, he says, "What was your major in college?" She said, "Art." So there's just nothing. It's nothing. It's all surface. It's all
no willingness.
Right. Yes.
Another dimension of alienation that is rising up for me that I think is intrinsic to Jungian work is the alienation from meaning.
Yeah.
And how excruciating that is. First and foremost, I think that when we're young, and I speak, for myself as well, of course, that we really don't know what things mean. We might be able to report the fact that a thing has occurred. We might manufacture various evolving levels of meaning. But it's often when there's a crisis around a meaning that's adequate to take me the next step forward that people come into a powerful self-inquiry. For Jung, one of the profound inquiries around meaning has to do with the relationship to the transcendent, that we often have these very childish perceptions of the divine that are formulated when we're 4, 5, or 6 years old, which are not sophisticated enough in order to carry us into an adult relationship to the self. And finally, around midlife, that alienation of meaning comes to a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm wanting to step onto the other side of this duality that we've articulated here today, into exile, and think about the difference between, what our intrapsychic processes, where we find meaning and growth and development, versus what happens interpersonally or in the collective between people. Because I think they get mixed up in life, as well as with tricky definitions of, how much is out there and how much is in here. How much is what is done to us, or we perceive it as being done to us, of injustices, hurt, wounding, victimization, and then the meaning that we make of it internally and what we do with it. So I think these terms really imply such a back and forth between out there and in here.
I once knew this man who was Iranian, and his family had been sort of for generations had worked in the Iranian government, and all he'd ever wanted to do was to be the ambassador to the United States from Iran. And then the revolution happened, and he really totally lost his homeland. Like, he loved Iran, he loved it deeply. But then after the revolution, he was living in exile, and he was so sad. He was so melancholic. And this was going to be his life story, that he'd permanently lost this thing that was so, so dear to him. That is an example of exile that could sort of turn into an experience of alienation, I think, if it isn't held in the right way.
Say more about that. Go a little deeper into that.
Well, I think, Deb, what you were talking about, this kind of back and forth between that which is done to us.
Mm-hmm.
And for this man, for example, and this was many, many years ago, and I have no idea kind of what he wound up doing with it. But he truly had been exiled in the most literal sense of the term. And I think it was also an experience of psychological exile in the thing that meant so much to him, that had so much meaning to him, was taken from him. But then I think it's like, so what do we do when we're in that state? And if we rest into it and let it become too rigid, if we let it become too concretized, then we might start to feel bitter and alienated.
So, for instance, with that particular person, that he had a kind of identification with Persia, with kind of the Persian image and history and the nationality around that.
Absolutely, yes.
And then in the Civil War, the familiar suddenly becomes alien and dangerous.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he's fleeing or cast out. But internally, I'm also wondering if he can continue to lay claim to the national identity that he had.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a sense that that is now gone, or perhaps gone forever? And then who is he?
And how do we find that home within?
This is really such a big question. It's a gigantic, ultimately sort of existential question. And of course, what Jung says, and it just sounds, I think, almost simplistic to just say it in words, but that we need to have a relationship with the infinite. We need to have a relationship with the self.
Yeah.
According to Edward Edinger, and we'll put this in the show notes, his book, Ego and Archetype, the child starts out as a deity because it's all one, the self. And ego has yet to emerge. And then the something greater, of course, is in the relationship with the parent, who is all the needs meter, the all supplying, the significant other. And as we grow and develop, ego differentiates from this, unconscious state. But then we need to find it again. We need to find the relationship with something that is non-ego, not me. And I'm thinking about how we also continue to need external world people, relationships, and resources. That if it's premature for a developing child to somehow be cut off, perhaps emotionally, from a parent, we know that early trauma can be devastating. And I'm thinking of the person you knew, Lisa, to be cut off from homeland, from culture, from tradition, from language prematurely is, truly it can be tragic.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully in the course of development, and because we have been thwarted by external world circumstances, we've been wounded, we've been cut off, hopefully that can be the impetus and the necessary medicine, as you always say, Joseph, to finding a relationship with the self.
I wanted to circle back to, as you were talking about Neumann's ideas, because it brings up a dimension we haven't talked about, which is developmental exile. That in the beginning, or perhaps there can be a really prolonged enmeshment in the child-mother dynamic. And Neumann would call this an Ouroboros problem. And so someone could be in the late teens or maybe even early adulthood and still be incredibly over-influenced by the maternal relationship. And this is not exclusive just to the external biological mother, but the whole archetype of the mother stays overwhelmingly powerful. And there's a kind of necessary exile that person has to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not that's activated by the self or activated by some kind of self-inquiry process, they have to kind of get kicked out of all of that dependency and infantile relationship.
Right. So exile is a necessary step on the path toward individuation and part of initiation. And it's also part of the hero's journey, right? I mean, just think about Star Wars, Luke comes back and sees that his aunt and uncle's village got burned down. And then he goes back to Obi-Wan Kenobi and he's like, let's go. I'm gonna leave home.
And the Jews being exiled from Egypt, it's exile, but it's also their liberation. It's also an incredibly painful decades wandering in this inhospitable land, undergoing a kind of purification process in preparation to find the promised land, the new home, or perhaps the actual home instead of the proxy for home.
Yeah, that's the perfect metaphor, right? And I think it does go to this question about, so what do we do with exile? Because in some sense, it has to be suffered. It just has to be suffered. If it's part of a process, it does lead somewhere. But if somehow you stay stuck there, then you don't find the promised land. If you don't do that work of kind of purification and transformation. There's just a little snippet of a fairy tale that I want to bring up here related to that. It's the Nixie of the Mill Pond, which is an extraordinarily long, beautiful fairy tale. And I don't want to take too much time with it, so I'm not going to give you the whole setup. But basically, this man and this woman have found each other after many trials and tribulations, and they're really happy. But then as soon as they get together, there's a force, I can't remember now. I think it's a witch that drives them apart. There's a flood that comes and overtakes them and carries them far away. And when the water disperses and they both touch dry land again, they've regained their human forms, but they didn't know where the other was. They found themselves among strange people who did not know their native land. High mountains and deep valleys lay between them. In order to keep themselves alive, they were both obliged to tend sheep. For many long years, they drove their flocks through field and forest and were full of sorrow and longing. When spring had once more broken forth on the earth, they both went out one day with their flocks, and as chance would have it, they drew near each other. They met in a valley, but did not recognize each other, yet they rejoiced that they were no longer so lonely. Henceforth, they each day drove their flocks to the same place. They did not speak much, but they felt comforted. One evening, when the full moon was shining in the sky and the sheep were already at rest, the shepherd pulled the flute out of his pocket and played on it a beautiful but sorrowful air. When he had finished, he saw that the shepherdess was weeping bitterly. "Why are you weeping?" he asked. "Alas," she answered, "thus shone the full moon when I played this air on the flute for the last time, and the head of my beloved rose out of the water." He looked at her, and it seemed as if a veil fell from his eyes, and he recognized his dear wife. And when she looked at him and the moon shone in his face, she knew him also. They embraced and kissed each other, and no one need ask if they were happy. So I think it's just that idea, Joseph, that you were talking about, sort of wandering in the desert for many long years before we finally return home and kind of are recalled to ourselves in a sense.
I'm thinking about the lament played on the flute. and how important it is to lament, to have access to our sadness and our longing and the feeling in this process. In the opera Nabucco, there is this incredible chorus of where the Hebrews have been exiled to Babylonia, and they sing this chorus that is just heart-stopping.
Yeah, it's called Va Pensiero.
Ah,
And one of the lines is, "O mia patria, si bella e perduta." Oh, my homeland, so beautiful and so lost. And I wanted to just read a little bit about, I'm just going to read from the Wikipedia page about it. It's such an important chorus. Verdi composed Nabucco at a difficult moment in his life. His wife and small children had all just died of various illnesses. So he said he wasn't going to compose any more operas, but then he did. He was promised to write this when he was given the libretto. He happened to open the libretto to Va Pensiero, and seeing the phrase, he heard the words singing. And at the first rehearsal, apparently the stagehands shouted their approval, then beat on the floor and the sets with their tools to create an even noisier demonstration. And apparently, upon Verdi's death, along his funeral's cortege in the streets of Milan, bystanders started spontaneous choruses of Va Pensiero. A month later, when he was reinterred alongside his wife, a young Arturo Toscanini conducted a choir of 800 in the famous hymn. And Deb, I know you've actually seen it. What's it like?
It is so moving. The audience is completely silent. They play it once, the entire house is silent, and then they play it again. It speaks so powerfully to what exile and longing and alienation feel like, and the unbearableness, and yet the beauty of being able to feel that feeling.
And there is a beauty in sorrow, in fully held sorrow that inhabits us.
It points to our ability to bear it and to express it. And of course, Verdi had such a great gift, but it's also the transcendence that I think makes it so powerful. And of course, it points to we have access to that as well, that we can be in it and bear it and at the same time transcend it in some way. It's really paradoxical, but it is in a way a union of the opposites.
What it brings up for me is the word exile. In my own associations and in the imagery that constellate around the word, always implies movement. Like when you think of someone in exile, that they're alive, they're moving, they're suffering, and they have been deprived of their autonomy or their property, but they are still in motion. And that does speak to the human soul, the power to survive, the power to remake after we have lost. And I'd love to bring this down to a really very ubiquitous example, which I'm going from the sublime to something immediate. The whole experience of a one-sided breakup. That somebody comes in and says, I was very much in love, and all of a sudden, my girlfriend says, this isn't right for me. And the fellow's thinking, I don't want this to end. The girlfriend's thinking, this is how it's going to be. And the tremendous exile that the spouse that did not want to leave carries. And we can all identify with this, the sense of loss, the sense of agony in the chest, the bitterness, the uncertainty, the anxiety, the incredible spectrum of passion that breaks forward when we are exiled from a relationship. I'm also thinking about the death of a loved one, that both the one who has passed and the one who is left often have the feeling of being exiled, exiled into different planes of existence.
Yeah, yeah. Exiled from one another. So painful. And I'm also thinking, just in a very kind of literal sense, if any of us have worked with people who have immigrated, whether or not they chose to immigrate or perhaps, had to out of necessity because of conditions in their homeland. I mean, it's a very painful experience to be an immigrant in some ways. Even if you were excited to immigrate, there's that loss of homeland, and that I knew a woman this is many years ago when I was in college, and there was a woman from France who was studying, and we became friends. And one day, I think we were just talking about something, and I just mentioned kind of how wonderful French bread was. And she looked at me, and her eyes filled with tears.
Mm.
She was just so bereft of not having access to that aspect of her culture and her life.
So even if we've made a choice to separate from where we were living, or a relationship, or a job for that matter, we can still internalize it as a kind of exile.
Yeah, and again, for me, I think exile comes with that sense of longing. Joseph, I know you were saying that it can also bring up feelings of bitterness or even a desire for revenge, which I think is true too.
I think of the difference between exile and rejection. The rejection, I think, is what can bring forth anger and bitterness. Of your example, Joseph, of one partner in a relationship says, it's over, and that the person who hasn't chosen it is the one that will often feel particularly angry and have a desire to get even, which is, of course, why so many divorces are so hard fought and so bitter and so difficult and contentious.
I think, yes, to be exiled, to be forcefully removed, of course, feels like a rejection.
Yeah.
If it's a really active thing that is imposed upon us, again, another ubiquitous thing people are having all over the country is being laid off from work. People internalize that as an exile.
Absolutely.
All the fear and uncertainty around that.
Well, you don't only lose your job, but in many cases you lose the community to which you belong when you lose a job.
Absolutely. You lose an identity because of the amount of time we spend in the work environment. It's a big part of how we perceive ourselves. I wanted to circle back a little bit to the idea of alienation. And I'm wondering if there is a way that we can hold both the positive and the negative polarity around it. And I was thinking about the etymology of the word alienation, and the most ancient root of the word is just the al, which simply means beyond. That something has moved beyond me, within me, around me. And there's something archetypally neutral about that. Sometimes that can be a very positive maturational experience. Sometimes it can be excruciating. But something about it moving beyond, or I'm moving beyond, puts a different patina on the word alienation, and a potential for even a positive outcome.
Say more. How would you see that positive outcome in your imagination, Joseph?
I think of individuals who are raised in very complicated and often toxic homes, which they are deeply embedded in and deeply enmeshed in. And this process of separating out from the family, which feels alienating in the modern sense of the word. But one of the things that they are often trying to do is to move beyond the influence, the negative influence of the family system. And once they are beyond it, then there is a field for self-definition or individuation on a certain level. So that moving beyond the impulse to alienate or become alien to my old way of being can have positive inferences.
Mm-hmm. And it may be that we have to kind of pass through a sort of dark night of the soul to find the new meaning, kind of reconstitute that sense of meaning. And in the interim, there's this dark valley that feels kind of empty and meaningless.
Or that new clever phrase, the uncanny valley. Uncanniness is unsettling. That we have to move through this uncanny valley in order to arrive at the place where we will be unique, that we will be more ourselves, even though it is unsettling, disturbing, strange, mysterious, as we make that trek.
So, in a way, this points to the meaningfulness of the uncanny valley or the dark night of the soul, or Jonah in the belly of the whale. In all this darkness, the light is that something new can be found. It's a real mythological and archetypal area of emphasis over and over again.
I want us to be careful from jumping too quickly to the positive aspect, because I think that is the hope, and I think that is many, many times what does happen. And I don't know that it always happens. I remember once hearing a dream that just chilled me. The dream was simply that I was waiting in line at the post office and the line never moved.
I think that's a definition of hell.
But it does kind of capture that feeling of alienation and meaninglessness. And for some people, that may be where they live much of their lives. It's a dark, dark thought. I'm thinking, I had said earlier that this was sort of a modern phenomenon, but then I was reminded of this incredible passage from Macbeth that I think is sort of the same territory that we're in. He says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. To the last syllable of recorded time, all of our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So that is the hell of meaninglessness that often accompanies an experience of alienation. And yes, we hope that we undergo it only to be reconnected with a sense of vitality and aliveness on the other side. And yet I don't know that there's a guarantee that happens.
I know that I have a real predilection toward optimism, and yet my optimistic bias takes me into suffering. And the quote from Macbeth, I don't know, is so much a portrait of what I consider suffering as it is a depiction of pain. Mm-hmm. And I make a real distinction between the two, because pain is all that's in that quote and many, many more. But suffering brings a consciousness to it and a kind of radical acceptance of that this is what is, but I am here.
Right. Then it becomes soul making.
And becomes soul making, which is what is so moving in Verdi's chorus, La Pensiero, that we are here, we long, we feel the sorrow, which is a connection internally with feeling. And that makes all the difference. It can make all the difference. And your point is well taken that, it's not a contract. It's not a transaction of here's the deal and you'll come out the other side and live happily ever after. However, the possibility is there.
And I think central to Jung's own story, which gave rise to his psychology, is that human beings have an unbelievable spiritual capacity to suffer, to remake themselves, and to find internal resources that they might not have imagined that they had access to.
He writes so movingly about this period in his life, which he calls confrontation with the unconscious in his memoir. But he talks about how important it was to have a normal life in the real world as a counterpoise to that strange, we could call it alien, inner world. My family and profession remained the base to which I could always return, assuring me I was actually existing, an ordinary person. And he would repeat to himself, I have a medical diploma from a Swiss university. I must help my patients. I have a wife and 5 children. I live at 228 Seestrasse in Kuschnacht. These were actualities which made demands upon me and proved to me again and again that I really existed, that I was not a blank page whirling about in the winds of the spirit. And I think that points to being able to be present in some way for whatever the daily demands on your life are, of being tethered to, I have to wash the dishes, I have to get my kids off to school, of doing what we can do in the here and now, of reclaiming some sense of agency and meaning.
Well, before we switch to a dream today, we would like to leave you with a recording of Verdi's Pensiero. So enjoy, and we'll see you in a minute. Hello, listeners. This is Lisa, and I wanted to let you know that my book, Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, will be available this May from Sounds True Publishing. In my book, I take a deep dive into the psychological journey of motherhood using myths, personal stories, dreams, and of course, fairy tales. At my website, lisamarciano.com, you can read an excerpt from the book and learn more about me and my writing. You can also sign up for my free email course when you pre-order your copy. That's lisamarciano.com. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.
Today's dream is from a 33-year-old male who works as a musician, a composer, editor, and a tutor. And here's his dream. I am in a conservatory. It is night, and the conservatory is dimly lit. It is a large room between two castle towers, and the stone walls of the castle can be seen at each end of the conservatory. I feel very comfortable in the room, and I even begin to consider how I could move in with my belongings. An old friend from my music college years appears and tells me that the stone walls outside are covered with crystals and diamonds. He also says, the diamonds are strong enough to cut the scales of a dragon. Then we spend some time making incisions in the wood with these diamonds, though it feels like a childish exercise. I tell my friend that there is a hidden room in one of the towers, and I invite him to follow me to this room. As we walk, I mention other rooms, an organ room, a library, and we ascend staircases along the way. The corridors and staircases become more narrow and awkward. I enter the secret room alone. It is empty and very small. I feel extremely uncomfortable, as though there is a strong, invisible presence there, and I feel terrified. I leave the room and rejoin my friend. The building is different, and we join a crowd of people exiting a theater. I wake from the dream. Here's a bit of context. Contrary to the view of my family and friends, I sometimes feel a sense of insecurity about my gifts as a musician, and if I should even continue to make music. I am a very creative person, and I am almost always composing a new work. The main feelings in the dream were, at first, comfort or hominess, and then fear. He adds, around 10 years ago, I graduated after my study at a music conservatory. However, since then, the theme of a hidden or secret room in a large complex building has been a recurring dream for me, and I experience the dream perhaps once or twice a year with similar, overwhelming feelings of fear.
Well, sometimes I read a dream and I just feel like I know what it's about.
Go for it.
Yeah.
I think we're all having that feeling, maybe.
Yes, I think so.
Let's see if we all have the same feeling.
Okay, you go first.
I think he's not taking his creative gifts seriously enough. And that is shown by these diamonds that he's using to carve into wood. I mean, they're strong enough to carve into dragon scales, but he's carving into wood and it feels childish. So he's sort of playing. He's playing with something that's really numinous. And he goes and he finds this room and he has an encounter with the self, right? That's this invisible presence that's terrifying and awe-inspiring.
Yep.
He doesn't say awe-inspiring. I'm sort of interpolating that. And it scares him and he leaves. And then he goes back and then he's just part of this crowd. And that's kind of this moment of the regressive restoration of the persona.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Deb, what are you thinking?
I was very much along the same lines, that it starts out, sort of like a fairy tale. And everything is really wonderful here. There's the large room between two castle towers, stone walls, how he could move in with his belongings. The old friend is there, these magical crystals and diamonds that are strong enough to cut the scales of a dragon, but instead they do this, quote, childish exercise of making some incisions in the wood. And then there is this encounter, up the stairs, the organ room, the library, and then there's the secret room, and he's uncomfortable, as though there is a strong invisible presence there, and I feel terrified. And that is what, if he were here, I would want him to say more about where that is in him and in his life. He's 33 years old. He says that he's really creative. And I agree that when will it be time?
He's resisting the daimon.
Exactly. And when will it be time to make a commitment to his own inner work as expressed through his outer work? 33 is a really significant age. It's the age that Jesus was when he died. So I think it's somehow significant of a real call to something deeper, something that has some terror in it.
I mean, I'm aligned with all the things you guys have said. Thinking about being haunted by your daimon, I remember sometime in the past I was reading a book about James Hillman called A Blue Fire, which is a lot about his biography. And Hillman is a remarkably articulate, innovative person in the Jungian world. And he talks about discovering his own capacity to write. And in his younger life, and by that I mean kind of middle school and high school, he had a horror when he would approach writing. And upon reflection, as he's now in his mature years writing the book, he says that the horror was evoked because of the magnitude of destiny that writing was portending for him. And so there's something about growing into one's gifts. So I think that's part of, as you guys have said, what might be haunting him.
It's happened to me recently in my practice, actually, that I've worked with a couple of people who, in one way or another, have been avoiding a gift, or I want to say something like afraid of the great power.
Yes.
And it sets up this dynamic of sort of evasion in their lives. And it can look on the surface like anxiety. But really it's about, it's time to face what is within you. It's like that quote from the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas: if you bring forth what is in you, it will heal you. And if you do not bring it forth, it will kill you. Something like that. I'm probably getting that and butchering that a little bit. And there's also a quote from both Jung and von Franz say something like this. And unfortunately, I can't find the exact chapter.
I have the von Franz quote.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Go for it.
She says, one of the most wicked, destructive forces, psychologically speaking, is unused creative power.
Yeah.
If someone has a creative gift and out of laziness or for some other reason doesn't use it, the psychic energy turns to sheer poison. That's why we often diagnose neuroses and psychotic diseases as not lived higher possibilities.
And I would just like to make the distinction that I think is implicit in all this about the difference between dedication and commitment and the actual product or outcome. It's not that you have to be Shakespeare if you're a writer or Verdi if you're a composer, but it is that you have to give yourself to the work and the gift you have been given to the fullest extent possible. So it's an orientation really to the self of I will use myself in your service.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
I'd like to also unpack just a little bit more of the imagery because it's interesting and symbolic. When he starts saying that there's a large room between two castle towers, it evokes the image of the 18th tarot card, the moon. And in that card, there's a pool of water a path that goes through fields and plowed fields and up into a mountain. There's a liminal space in the card between the plowed fields and this mystical violet-colored space beyond it. And on that liminal edge, there are two towers. One of the ways that's often interpreted is the towers represent the capacity of the ego to manipulate its environment, to create and meet its own needs. And it also infers that there is something beyond the tower, beyond the protective isolation of the fortress, that requires one to leave the tower and go on an inner sojourn. It's suggested that this inner sojourn has an evolutionary pressure behind it. And so for me, I wonder if we're kind of starting there on a liminal space based on this amplification. The other thing I'd like to say about the diamond, and particularly in the dream, there's a context of its power to etch and cut. I was thinking about how challenging it is to impress certain things upon the soul, how difficult it is to make changes in our personality on a deep, deep level. But the stone of the wise, or this incredible tool that he has in the dream, would be capable of etching something on his inner life, etching something into his soul, which actually might be permanent. And it's being used, as he said, for childish purposes. But it holds this promise of engaging this mythologic creature or having an effect on the archetypal world, but he hasn't made that transition out of the childish use to this other thing that might be more frightening or more heroic. The other thing that I'm wondering about is the friend. I don't know whether the friend is gendered in the way the story is told, female or male, but I would want to know more about the inner companion, because that can give us a lot of sense around what shadow elements sometimes are helping us out even.
It's implied that the companion is male.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, he says the old friend from music college appears. He also says the diamonds are strong enough to cut the scales of a dragon. So it's a shadow figure. And what I was really struck by is a friend appears at the beginning and again at the end of the dream. But when it is time to go into the secret room that is empty and very small, the dream ego must go alone.
Mm-hmm.
This also reminds me of moments in analysis where people finally verbalize the secret, which is the center of their kind of neurotic suffering.
Mm-hmm.
This goes to Freud's discovery that often we need to have a deeply confessional part of analysis in order to discharge the energy of where we're locked up. So I wonder about the secrets in the secret room that are powerful enough to terrify him.
That is a really good point, Joseph. And Jung has this beautiful quote that I won't get quite right, but that in the work, that when he discovers the patient's secret, the rock against which he has been shattered, that is the nexus or the turning point of the work. And it's not that the secret is something that the person has been hiding from the analyst necessarily, but something that he does not know about himself.
You know, I'll just a little fairy tale amplification here. Going up into a tower and finding a remote room in which there's an encounter reminds me of Sleeping Beauty.
Yep.
And Sleeping Beauty's encounter in the tower with the old woman who has the spindle and then she pricks her finger and falls down dead for 100 years. That is, without belaboring it too much, that scene is an image of encounter with destiny, an encounter with one's fate. And I wonder if that's what this dreamer is needing to encounter.
And the fate can be surprising. It may very well be that he has a destiny beyond being a musician in the way that he has been. And often in midlife, people do find that they're led in a new direction. I certainly was. Many people find that there's another leg of the journey and a remaking process that is frightening to even conceive of.
Right. And I want to say just something about the dragon too, because dragons, especially in Asian cultures, are signify the life force. And in our Western imaginations of dragons, they are often the keepers of the chthonic treasure. So the treasure is the gold that is often kept underground.
So this could be a great dream to use for active imagination. Often when we have recurring dreams, it's because the unconscious feels that there is something we are not integrating, and so it offers it to us again and again. So if this were my dream, I would go into a deep, relaxed, meditative state. I would stage the dream as it is from the beginning, with myself as a character, and play it forward in my imagination rather meticulously. And then by the time I enter into the secret room, I might have some feelings that are evoked, but I would stay in the secret room. I might call out into the room, inviting something to make itself visible. I might stay there with the conscious ego having more capacity than the dream ego, and trying to discern what is this presence and what does it want from me, or what does it want to do to me or give to me.
I think that is a really apropos suggestion, especially as our dreamer says that he experiences this dream once or twice a year. So something important is trying to get his attention.
So we encourage you to be bold, be courageous, put yourself back in that room and see if you can wrestle that presence into revealing itself and telling you what you need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.